I undertake the training to not exploit others or any aspect of the environment, and form the intention to bring forth loving kindness, learning ways to work for the well-being of people, animals, plants, and minerals. I undertake the training to practice generosity by sharing my time, energy, and material resources with those who are in real need. Now, when I reread that, and every time I read that, it can seem a bit overwhelming. That's a lot to ask of me, of us. That's a whole lot to hold. And we can do this, as Lee spoke about Monday. One way we can begin doing this is simply recognizing the generosity of nature that's all around us. Just that awareness. And in addition to this, training in the second precept also orients us to the cultivation of contentment. We can become aware of ways to replace wanting more and more with a sense of satisfaction with what we already have and with what is freely given. And the more content we become, the more generous we can also be. When we find contentment in what we already have, we free ourselves from the restlessness and agitation that often comes with wanting. And we can have more time and energy to devote ourselves to the cultivation of our practice and wholesome qualities. The Aryavamsa Sutta, the discourse on the traditions of the noble ones, talks about monks being content with the alms or the food that is given to them, with the lodgings that are freely offered to them. And also, and I hadn't quite remembered this, with whatever cloth is given for their robe. It states there is a case where a monk is content with whatever cloth he gets for his robe. He doesn't do anything harmful for the sake of obtaining this cloth. If he doesn't get any cloth, he isn't agitated. If he does get cloth, he uses it without being attached to it or infatuated with it. He is guiltless, seeing the harms that attachment can bring, and he discerns how not to get caught up in them. He doesn't take pride in himself or judge others because he's able to be content. In this, he is skillful, energetic, alert, and mindful. And this last piece is really important because it says this isn't a passive process. It requires skill, effort, energy, and mindfulness. Now, this discussion of cloth robes really stood out for me this time around, the sutta. I've only recently heard the term fast fashion. Now, most of you may have already heard this or been aware of it. I'm often slow to the party, slow learner, as Bill would say. But I looked up this term and I learned about the scope of this industry that is about quickly putting out cheap, trendy clothing. And it's clothing that's designed to be worn only a few times and then thrown out as a new fashion takes its place. And this is often week to week. And I began putting together pieces of information that had just been on the periphery of my awareness. The pop-up clothing ads that constantly appear as I read news on my smartphone. And they're so tempting, and they immediately activate my wanting mind. That t-shirt is so cool. It's just what I like. I'd be so cool in that, as if cool were a possibility for me. And I have to say, I put this shirt on specifically today, not because it's cool, but because it's the oldest thing in my closet and still my favorite. I think it's about 40 years old. Bless its heart. Also, I put together news pieces about the problem of landfills that are filled with just clothing and how difficult it is recycling this clothing because of all the different synthetic fibers that can't be sorted out and recycled separately. Also, news stories about the dangerous, toxic working conditions and unlivable wages, often including child and slave labor in the factories producing this clothing to make it as cheap as possible. As the scope of the harmful impact of this industry truly began to sink in, I also remembered stories I'd heard in the news over the past few years about the value of secondhand clothing stores, about individuals who voluntarily have chosen to no longer buy any new clothing, only buy secondhand, and stories about how to mend and repair still usable clothing. And to be honest, I'd mostly dismissed these stories as just fluff pieces and maybe just stories about what was trendy now. Oh, now it's cool to shop resale. Or just being too extreme. Who's going to commit themselves to never buying a new piece of new clothing? Or to mend clothing like my mother used to? Aren't we beyond that? However, as I read more about this harmful industry, and as I thought about contentment, those practices and activities made so much more sense and seemed so much more important to non-harm and to the welfare of our world. This is what the second precept is talking about. Being aware of the exploitation, inequity, and oppression involved in this industry. People who are not freely giving of their labor, but are often coerced into this labor. I can bring forth loving kindness and compassion and practice being content with all the clothes I do have, with being content, with paying more for clothing that is more sustainably produced to last longer and in factories that value the health, safety, and well-being of those who work there and of the environment. Just this one example speaks to the great benefit of practicing compassion as part of the second precept and what benefits this can bring to ourselves and our world. Indeed, the Buddha states that contentment is the greatest wealth. However, the Buddha also teaches that contentment is not necessarily an end in and of itself. Circling back to the Aryavamsa Sutta, it concludes with the Buddha going on to say, once the monk has developed contentment with these material objects, such as clothing, food, and shelter, the monk finds pleasure and delight in using this contentment to develop skillful mental qualities and abandoning unskillful mental qualities. In this, again, he is skillful, energetic, alert, and mindful. He has the energy to put in that effort. Here, The Buddha is reminding us that contentment provides the steadiness that is a foundation for our practice, but not the end of our practice. A person who is content conserving energy that's necessary to practice diligently. A contented person knows they already have their material needs met. They don't have to waste or steal time, resources, physical or mental energies, seeking happiness through external sources like material possessions, power, prestige. And the Buddha takes this one step farther and also recommends that we shouldn't feel readily content even with our achievements. In saying this, the Buddha recognizes contentment contains the risk of being without a goal or without direction and may become a hindrance if we choose to simply stop there. It can be tempting to want to cling to just being content and happy. Isn't that what this is about? We may not want to put energy into anything that requires difficult effort, or we may want to push away or be blind to anything that creates discontent and discomfort, like awareness of the fast fashion industry and the impact of our clothing choices. We have to ask ourselves and be able to discern, am I hiding in contentment? And is it wobbling toward complacency and laziness? Am I clinging to just holding on to ease and resting on my laurels and being unwilling to explore new or challenging areas for growth and awareness? The Buddha would not have attained enlightenment if he'd only been content. If he had been content with the pleasures and comforts of his palace, he would never encounter the truth and reality of old age, sickness, and death that led him to pursue a path to alleviate suffering. He learned to be content with very little in the way of material goods and achieved the highest levels of absorption and concentration through working with the master teachers of his day. But if he'd been content with just this accomplishment, he would have simply remained with these teachers and not continued on in his more difficult and solitary quest and finally achieved enlightenment. We can practice being content with what we have in our lives as a foundation that allows us to energize and grow our practice. In this way, we can appreciate contentment as well as honor our non-content as a potent energy to encourage the continuing development of our practice and keep us moving on the path. The Buddha did this. We can too. We can find the joy in both being content and being inspired by our non-content. Thank you so much for your kind and generous attention